This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
What's up, jerks?
Manning retired.
Which one?
Both.
I like kickers.
Put him on the board. Hausch Mazzoli. Got it. Championship.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network, brought to you by the Fan Up Network. I am Jason Jarvi, taking you through all the ins and outs of fantasy football. We're still a good 2 months away from any real football actually being played, but it's never too early to start talking about fantasy football, all the news that's happening. Minicamps have gotten started all around the league, and there's news flying in from everywhere. So that's where I'm going to start with some NFL news. To start off, Pete Carroll from Seahawks Minicamp, as they're wrapping up, is saying that Russell Wilson has taken a clear step forward. Obviously, with the loss of Beast Mode Marshawn Lynch, they're going to become more of a passing team. And he said that he can really see him as a real true vet now. He's made a clear step ahead, and his command is like all time. His ability to move defenders with his eyes, set up some things. He's doing stuff more subconsciously. So that does sound good for anybody if you are in a keeper league where you have Russell Wilson. But Russell Wilson finished last season as close to, probably he's at least a top 10 quarterback, probably a top 5 in some leagues. I think you're only going to see similar results. He's going to be a top 10 quarterback this year, with the possibility of being in the top 5, maybe even in the top 3. Only time will tell what's going to bring for him. He's definitely going to hurt the loss of not having Marshawn Lynch. If Thomas Rawls can come back, or if one of the guys that they drafted, like CJ Prosise, can come in and lighten that load, that will definitely help him. Robert Griffin III in the Cleveland Browns, they're saying that he's been looking pretty shaky in practice, which is not good. We kind of knew going in RG3 wasn't going to be the savior for the Cleveland Browns, but I think they hoped that he was going to at least, I don't know, provide some sort of stopgap until they can bring in their franchise quarterback. But according to ESPN, in 6 of the practices that are open to the media, Griffin had as many bad throws as good ones, meaning that passes that were tipped, intercepted, or should have been intercepted. He had poor footwork. He was just kind of playing it safe, going to checkdowns, which that on one hand is good. You want to see RG3 making more check down throws if he sees that all of his first and second options are open. But you also have to bear in mind that these are practices where a quarterback isn't actually getting hit. So how's that going to translate when he actually goes into week 1 and he has a defensive end bearing down on him? It's going to be a work in progress. And I'd wait and see. I'm pretty sure Robert Griffin isn't going to start on anybody's team. He definitely has the skills, but I would just be worried about all that report coming out of Cleveland. St. Louis wrapped up their minicamp, and they're saying that they traded up in the draft this year to pick Jared Goff. And Coach Jeff Fisher said, heading into training camp, the number 1 starter is Case Keenum, that guy, not Jared Goff. So you have Case Keenum, Jared Goff likely number 2, and Sean Mannion behind him. It's a little disturbing, but he said that we're going to start Jared Goff whenever he's ready, and that he's not putting Keenum at first to imply that Jared Goff isn't going to start the opener. He just wants to keep his options open. So more than likely, come week 1, Jared Goff is going to be the starter for the St. Louis Rams. And we're going to cover the NFC West today. Jared Goff isn't a quarterback that you're going to want to rely on this year, though. In the New Orleans Saints, CJ Spiller, he was definitely, when he came in there last year, had some high hopes, got injured, which that's really no new news for CJ Spiller. But going into training camp this year, he's looking like he's number 3 on the depth chart. It's going to be Mark Ingram, Tim Hightower, who came out of relatively non-existence last year to help out when Mark Ingram got hurt last year. And then it's going to be Spiller after him. And, it's on one hand, it's good for Tim Hightower because, a guy gets another chance to be in the league. He's more of a traditional running back, which I think people want to see in fantasy football. But CJ Spiller is still going to get some play if he's healthy, and I think that's what Sean Payton is saying, is that whenever CJ Spiller does get right and he's fully healthy, he's going to be a cog in that offense. Because you saw what happened when they had Darren Sproles on the team. They had that fast pass-catching running back out of the backfield. He may not get a ton of rushing yards, but he's definitely going to be used in the passing game. So definitely keep an eye on the situation. And as always, you want to make sure if CJ Spiller is healthy or not. Earlier this week, there was some Twitter rumors. It was really odd. It was stated that Le'Veon Bell had skipped or failed a mandatory drug test and that he was going to be suspended. So I saw this, I think, Tuesday night, and immediately I was like, what? Are you serious? This guy is dealing with drug situations again. So I went on Twitter, I tried to find really any real credible sources, the Adam Schefters, the Ian Rappaports, and I didn't see that. And that was my first kind of red flag that, maybe there isn't a whole lot of credibility to that. So then Le'Veon Bell actually came out and he said that, he hasn't missed any drug test, he hasn't failed any drug test, and that he's fine. He came out to the Pittsburgh Review, and so I don't think he probably didn't fail any of these drug tests. This is probably some work of a troll job. Obviously, you're going to want to monitor it because if he is facing some sort of suspension, that's going to hurt his draft stock. He'll likely still be a first-round pick, unless, of course, he's out for, 8 to 16 games. But Le'Veon Bell, more than likely, going to be okay, good to go. A couple of episodes ago, we talked about Trent Richardson coming out and saying that he believes that he can still make it into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Now, I think everyone pretty much laughed at him, and this newest news report is not going to help his case at all. Apparently, he needs arthroscopic knee surgery, according to the Baltimore Sun, due to a pre-existing condition. And supposedly transformed his body, dropping 20 pounds. But this is definitely not a good sign and not the way you want to start a quote-unquote comeback with a team. Trent Richardson, more than likely, not going to make a difference this year. But it's definitely disappointing for a guy who does want to still be playing, but he's just not going to be able to make it. Another guy that disappointed last year coming out, Melvin Gordon. He was a rookie last year. People were actually saying that he would be the better rookie than Todd Gurley. We obviously all know that was a big mistake. But as far as Melvin Gordon goes last year, it really was a surprise that he just didn't produce. He only got 3.5 yards per carry. He had a pretty big fumbling problem, and it seemed like he didn't have the trust of the Chargers team. So this season, going into the end of minicamps, Coach Mike McCoy said people would have never known he was injured last year if they watched him take part in the recent workouts. So I don't know if this may just be the coach trying to put lipstick on a pig, but you never know. There was high hope for him coming out of college, and definitely what we saw last season, I don't think that was really indicative of what Melvin Gordon's career is going to be. I think there is some hope that Melvin Gordon could come in this year. I'm not saying he's going to be, world beater. He's not going to be a top 3 running back. But on that Chargers team with Phillip Rivers, with Keenan Allen, with Antonio Gates, with all the stuff that they had there, I think Melvin Gordon can be a productive running back. He could even be a number 1 running back at his best. We're going to have to see. We're going to have to wait and see, really, though. People are going to be wary of him in drafts. But if you want to take a risk on a guy, that might be a guy to, maybe draft him a round or 2 earlier than what he's predicted to go. And then to wrap up the NFL news, kind of a funny story. Carlos Williams, the rookie running back from last year who came onto the Bills, really picked up some slack for LaShawn McCoy when he was injured. He had a ton of concussion problems, but there's definitely hope going into this season. He came into camp clearly overweight, and he came out and said that he gained the weight because of his wife's pregnancy. His wife would wake up at 2 a.m. in the morning and say, "I want a snack," and he wasn't going to get her a snack and have her feel bad for eating at 2 a.m. in the morning. So he would join her in the snack taking. It's a fun, lighthearted story. And a lot of times you in the NFL, you have all the franchise tag negotiations with Muhammad Wilkerson and Von Miller, and the Ryan Fitzpatrick contract situation where it's all dark and really frustrating news. This, I think, it's as long as he doesn't get blimp up to the size of Eddie Lacy, Carlos Williams is going to be pretty fine. In minicamp, this is the time where you can come into camp being a little bit overweight, but in the next month or so that you have before training camp, they're going to go to work, and he'll probably be in shape. So by the beginning of training camp, we'll take another look at Carlos Williams, see if he's still at his pregnancy weight, but more than likely he will be ready to go come game time. And that's going to wrap up NFL news. And we'll jump into our next segment of Around the League, where each week I preview a different division and the players that you should be looking at on each of these teams. So I've already covered all of the North, all of the South, so I've decided to go to the West, and we'll start with the NFC West. And the division winners last year, the Arizona Cardinals, had a really, really good offensive season. They had a really good defense, but the offense it really came out of, I think the potential was there, but it kind of came out of nowhere. You had a lot of players on this team really find the fountain of youth. It's a saying that I don't like to say too often, but this is a team where you had 3 clear players really come out of nowhere. I mean, maybe even 4 if you want to count them, but I'll go over them. Carson Palmer, the quarterback, is where you have to start. He saved one of my leagues because I had drafted Andrew Luck, number 1 in the first round. And I kind of, in a throwaway move in the mid rounds, I took Carson Palmer because people were laying off him because of his age. He does have injury issues, but he really came on last year. Carson Palmer was a godsend for any team that was lucky enough to draft him or pick him up on the waiver wire. And, I mean, barring another injury, all the weapons are there for Carson Palmer to continue to have another good season. So I would draft him. He's probably going to be a top 10 quarterback drafted this year. Moving on to the running backs, the number 1 guy there right now is David Johnson. He was a rookie last year. He kind of had a mixed bag of a season. He scored a bunch of points. I don't think he was good enough to be top 5 running back wise, but he showed a lot of potential. He's definitely got speed and power, and people are ranking him right now in the top 5. I've seen him in as high as the number 2 rated running back this year, which I think it might be a little too early to do that for David Johnson. And I think he has the potential, but on this team where there are so many weapons, and I think that they still are a pass first offense with Carson Palmer and all the wide receivers that they have. David Johnson, he he'll have a good season, but I would be careful about him. I already said in a King's Decree that I think David Johnson he's not gonna be a top 10 running back this year. He's probably still gonna be productive, but it's not gonna be in the level that everybody's expecting of him. So another guy behind David Johnson, it's a guy that I was talking about with finding the fountain of youth. Chris Johnson came to the Cardinals last season. He just had down season after down season after leaving the Titans, going to the Jets. He came to the Cardinals and really found a home, and then ended up breaking his leg. So Chris Johnson, probably unfortunate because now David Johnson has pretty much secured the number 1 running back spot. But he'll probably still be in use, and that's another reason why I think David Johnson will suffer, because with a healthy Chris Johnson on your team, it's going to be a running back by committee. Both of those guys have talents that the team can use. So Chris Johnson will be a serviceable backup, and he's still worthy of drafting in most leagues. And behind him, Andre Ellington. This is a guy who, year in, year out, people have expected him to make that jump and be that guy. And I think it's about time people stop drafting Andre Ellington, because he's always hurt and he just has not produced. He hasn't taken that next step. So if you don't draft Andre Ellington this year, I'm not upset with that, because he's the clear number 3 guy, and it would take an enormous amount of injuries for him to be in the starting role and be able to get enough points to warrant him to be started in fantasy leagues. So moving on to the wide receivers, Larry Fitzgerald, fountain of youth. People were drafting him as the 30th or 40th ranked receiver, and he showed that he still has gas left in the tank. I think part of it is helped by the production of his other receivers on the team, and that they kind of moved Larry Fitzgerald into more of a slot wide receiver, that he's doing more across the middle routes, that they can utilize his talents of being a possession receiver, because the dude has an amazing range, and regardless of how old he is, he still does have some burners that if he catches a little 5-yard pass, he could turn it into a 40 to 50-yard reception. After Fitzgerald, you have John Brown. It's kind of a toss-up between John Brown and Michael Floyd. Some people will say Michael Floyd is the clear number 2. Some people will say John Brown. In my opinion, John Brown is the number 2 guy, just because he is. They're both kind of deep threats. I think John Brown's been a little bit more dependable, though. So they're both guys that you're gonna put out on the edge, have them go. Michael Floyd has had a few more injury problems. John Brown has had his injury problems as well, but it's a guy who has been producing year in, year out, and both of these guys are gonna sit somewhere between 600 to 800 yards for the season and catch somewhere between 4 and 6 touchdowns each. Neither of them are going to give you great production, but they're worthy of depth on your fantasy rosters, and one of them will give you a pretty solid game every here and there. And then behind him, you got J.J. Nelson, who is a promising wide receiver, but with everything else in front of him, I'm just not sure if he's going to. You can't rely on him to really start unless one of those guys, Fitzgerald, John Brown, Michael Floyd, go down. Then J.J. Nelson has a little bit more value, because Carson Palmer is going to have to throw the ball to somebody, and why wouldn't it be J.J. Nelson? He's more of a later round pick, and I wouldn't even be surprised if he didn't get drafted. And then at tight end, the only tight end on this team that has any value at the moment is Jermaine Gresham, another guy who really, his career in Cincinnati didn't really take off like it was supposed to. Comes to Arizona, and he kind of finds a resurgence. I don't think he's a fantasy starting tight end, but I think he's good enough to be a backup, or if you're looking for a bye week fill-in, Jermaine Gresham might be on the waiver wire, and he'd be a pretty solid pickup. So to recap the Cardinals, Carson Palmer, I'd look for him probably in the later parts of the early rounds to the middle rounds. I think you should draft him as a top 10 quarterback. David Johnson, he will be a first-round pick. Depending on how you value him, he could go as high as 2. Some people may be even crazy enough to draft him as number 1. I don't want to be that guy. If it's between David Johnson and Antonio Brown, I want to pick Antonio Brown. But really, David Johnson shouldn't slide out of the first round this year. Chris Johnson I'd look for him probably in somewhere between the 5th and the 7th round. If you do draft David Johnson, this would be one of those handcuff situations where you might want to draft Chris Johnson a little higher, just in case David Johnson doesn't pan out, or in case he gets hurt. Andre Ellington, as I said before, don't draft him. He has not done anything. Let him sit on the waiver wire. If he does happen to pan out, he does not have a game here or there, it's more likely a fluke, and he isn't going to do that the entire season. Larry Fitzgerald, the wide receivers are an interesting case, because I think I don't want to draft these guys too high, because there's a lot of wide receivers in the league now who can put up some big points for fantasy players. Larry Fitzgerald, I'd probably start looking somewhere in the later parts of the 4th round. You want to make sure you have a core of your team. You probably prefer to have Larry Fitzgerald as your second wide receiver. If you are relying on him as your number 1 guy, you might be stretching a little bit, and you really have to hope that Fitzgerald had similar or better production to last year. So probably somewhere in the 4th or 5th round, I'd look for Fitzgerald. John Brown, Michael Floyd, I'd look anywhere between the 7th to 9th rounds for those guys, because they are decent backups, and they're a plug and play. Usually when you're putting together your lineup, your number 1 and number 2 wide receivers are pretty much set. If you do have a third wide receiver position or a flex spot, John Brown and Michael Floyd are perfect players for those positions. And J.J. Nelson, maybe a late round flyer if anything, but more than likely I would let him go undrafted. And then for Jermaine Gresham, I wouldn't draft him until the real late rounds, or just let him go undrafted. And that brings us to the second place team in the NFC West, which is arguably probably better than the first team, the Seattle Seahawks. They're perennial Super Bowl contenders the past 3 years. They kind of ran into a buzzsaw last year with Carolina, but it was almost slated for a rematch, Denver and Seattle. And it all begins with the quarterback position and Russell Wilson, who, as I said earlier in the news, Pete Carroll is saying that Russell Wilson is looking better than he really ever has, which on one hand, it could just be coach talking about his player and talking him up. But if it is what he is saying, we could be in for a really, really good season for Russell Wilson. And that's, I tend to look more on the positive side with Russell Wilson. I have been a doubter of him in the past, but he's really showed last year when Marshawn Lynch was out for pretty much the last part of the season that he took over the offense and he was able to win games with his arm. He had some gigantic games at the end of the season. Definitely helped Doug Baldwin out. And I think Russell Wilson is going to have another good year. He could be propelled into top 5, top 3 quarterback points this year. Moving on to the running backs, it's more of a murkier situation. We have talked about it a little bit in past episodes. The number 1 guy going in right now is Thomas Rawls, but he's coming off an injury. And beyond him, there's Christian Michael. Then they got a couple rookies in CJ Prosise and Alex Collins. Now, normally I would talk about the number 1 guy and then move on. But it's kind of hard to talk about a guy if he hasn't really won the position. Thomas Rawls showed a lot of promise last season, but as we've seen on this Seahawks team, Pete Carroll isn't adverse to giving rookies a shot at a starting role. In his first year, they went out and gave a big contract to Matt Flynn to be the starting quarterback. And then, lo and behold, Russell Wilson, a third-round pick, comes out of nowhere and leads them to a Super Bowl title. So Thomas Rawls right now is the number one guy, but I don't think it's too far away from him, splitting time or even being a secondary running back on that team. Christian Michael, I think, by default becomes the number two, but this is the Seahawks have cut Christian Michael and now brought him back. So I don't think they have a whole lot of hope for him. I think there is more interest in the rookie running backs, and particularly, I really like CJ Prosise. I think he's going to be a rookie that people are going to look at and say that he kind of came out of nowhere. At Notre Dame, he split time between wide receiver and running back, and I think that makes him a really solid weapon in the Seattle offense. You look at what Percy Harvin was able to do when he was healthy on the Seahawks on their Super Bowl winning year, and he really provided a spark. They had Marshawn Lynch to ground and pound up the middle, but they were able to do bubble screens, have end arounds, and I really see the Seahawks using CJ Prosise that way. So I wouldn't be surprised if early in camp and early in the preseason, we see some flashes from CJ Prosise. And then they have Alex Collins, another rookie. He's likely going to be a backup. He may not even make the team, but definitely watch him in training camp and preseason. Wide receivers, Doug Baldwin, he came on last year and he had it propelled him into the top 10 of wide receiver scoring. And I think with the progression of Russell Wilson, the progression of Doug Baldwin's going to go. So I think Doug Baldwin, he made a name for himself and he's gotten better every year. And I think Baldwin's going to be a solid number. Right now, because we haven't seen him do it for an entire year, I think he's a low-end number one wide receiver with the potential to be a top wide receiver in fantasy. And then after him, you got Jermaine Kearse, who I think is he quietly gets the job done. He's not flashy about it, and all the Seattle wide receivers, you don't expect a lot from them because for so long they've had Marshawn Lynch to carry the majority of the load. But I think same with Doug Baldwin. With the progression of Russell Wilson, Jermaine Kearse is going to get better. I think he's going to make better reads. And Baldwin and Kearse are both, they are fast, but they're also pretty solid possession receivers. So I think Kearse will have he'll have a decent year. I think Baldwin's clearly number one, but Kearse may even be in that kind of 1A position. And then behind him, you got Tyler Lockett, who he had a pretty decent rookie season last year for a wide receiver. It's tough to come into the league as a rookie and produce right away. He didn't have gigantic games, but he definitely helped out on kick and punt returns, and he's that wide receiver who's going to stretch the field. So I see Tyler Lockett making another jump as well this season, and he could be a decent flex option the entire year. Moving to tight ends, obviously you have one of the best tight ends in the league in Jimmy Graham. The only issue with him is, can he stay healthy? Even from his time back in New Orleans, he's always had these nagging injuries. So the question will always be, how many games are you going to get out of Jimmy Graham? And last year there was a little bit of struggle at the beginning of the season, kind of figuring out his role. They were still really in the run first mindset. But I think if you're going more towards the passing game in Seattle, that definitely helps out Jimmy Graham. I think later in the season, before he got hurt, Jimmy Graham really started coming into his own. And I think this season, if Russell Wilson's going to be slinging the ball around, Jimmy Graham is going to be a gigantic target for him. So I'm not sure if he gets back to the same level that he was in New Orleans, but Jimmy Graham is going to be a top 10 tight end and draft him accordingly. So to recap the Seattle Seahawks, Russell Wilson, I would draft him probably starting in the 5th or 6th round. You may see people drop him a little lower, but I think Russell Wilson has the ability to be a quarterback who can win you fantasy games and can change your season. Thomas Rawls, because he's a number one guy, unless something happens in camp where he gets hurt or he's not producing like he should be, Thomas Rawls will likely go somewhere in the 3rd to 4th round, mainly because he is a starting running back. Christian Michael, I would wait on him till the mid to late rounds, and I would do the same for CJ Prosise, because both of those guys, unless we know that they're going to be used more in the offense, and until we know that, you can't really depend on them fantasy-wise. So I'd look for them in the mid to late rounds. Alex Collins, I'd let him go undrafted. He's a guy he'll sit on the waiver wire, and if the worst case scenarios happen, injuries happen, then you maybe take a look at Alex Collins. Doug Baldwin, I could see him going as high as the 2nd round, but more than likely he's a 3rd round guy. Somebody may jump up to draft him number 1. And at this moment, I'd rather have him as my really, really high-end wide receiver 2. But I think he will be able to produce, though, if you do get him as your number 1 wide receiver. Jermaine Kearse, I'd look for him somewhere starting in the 6th to 8th round. He's going to be dependable, but he's more than likely a wide receiver 3 to a flex option. And I'd almost put Tyler Lockett in that same situation. I'd put him somewhere in the 6th to 8th round. And those guys will probably go back and forth between having good games. And Jimmy Graham, depending on how his camp goes, how preseason is, if they're saying that he's healthy, you could draft Jimmy Graham as high as the 3rd or 4th round. This is a guy who wasn't too far removed from being a 2nd round player. So if Jimmy Graham's healthy, and if this offense is truly a passing offense now, Jimmy Graham will win you games, and he'll win you matchups in your fantasy games. So that's going to wrap up the Seattle Seahawks. We're going to take a quick break. When I come back, we'll finish up the NFC West, and I'll give you my King's Decree. You're listening to The Fantasy Nerds on Detroit Sports Podcast Network. The Fantasy Nerd Show is sponsored by the Fan Up Network. They've developed the ultimate fantasy football app. It's a one-stop shop for everything you need. You can track teams and scores across multiple platforms, get latest injury and player news, and access to expert advice. See the hot trends with waiver pickups and drops. It has everything you need to manage all your fantasy football teams. Android users can get the app in the Play Store, and an iPhone version is now available in the App Store. Go to fanupnetwork.com to learn more and follow them on Twitter at fanupnetwork. Welcome back to the Fantasy Nerds. We're going to wrap up the NFC West now. And I spent a lot of time on the Cardinals and the Seahawks because they have so much talent on their team. These next two teams are going to go a little quicker because they're more of a mess than the majority of the teams in the NFL. So the team that finished 3rd in the West last season were the St. Louis Rams. They've now moved to Los Angeles, which it's not going to help them at all. So they spent a high draft pick. They traded a bunch, really, to get Jared Goff. And as I said in the news portion earlier, currently Case Keenum is the number 1 quarterback. Now, I don't expect him to be the number one quarterback come week 1, I wouldn't be surprised if Case Keenum plays at some point this year, because Jared Goff is definitely going to go through some growing pains in LA. His main first duty when he does come in the league is going to be learning how to hand off left, hand off right, pitch left, pitch right. Just give the damn ball to Todd Gurley because he's their offense right now. So Jared Goff, the only value that he's going to have this season, I would draft him if you're in a keeper league, maybe, because he does have a pretty solid arm. And the Rams are, if they were able to get a solid wide receiver at some point, he could be an interesting quarterback to have in this league. He could be dependable, at least, because Todd Gurley is going to help make any quarterback look good. And so moving on right on to running backs, Todd Gurley, coming into last season, he was dealing with the ACL injury, and we weren't really sure if he was going to come in right away, be able to start, and he missed time right at the beginning of the season. But as soon as he got there and he was getting the first running back reps, he grabbed hold and he never let go. Trey Mason had a lot to be worried about because Todd Gurley is everything that the Rams hoped he would be. He's a number one running back, and fantasy-wise, he's that as well. He should be drafted in the first round. You could even draft him probably in the 1 to 6 range. I'm not drafting Todd Gurley number 1 overall right now, or just yet. But I wouldn't be surprised. Seasons going forward, he's going to be in the discussion for number 1 overall. Behind Todd Gurley, you got Trey Mason and Benny Cunningham. Both are really irrelevant unless Todd Gurley's hurt, and I wouldn't be surprised if one of those guys, or both, aren't on the team come week 1. Trey Mason has voiced his displeasure before about when they drafted Todd Gurley, and Mason really could possibly be a starting running back on another team. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see the Rams move Trey Mason or cut one of those guys outright. But if you are looking to own one of them, I would draft Trey Mason, if he's still on the team, to be that handcuff for Todd Gurley, because he's definitely going to be the second option. But otherwise, neither of those guys have a ton of value. Benny Cunningham maybe has a little value with his return game and his pass catching ability, but I think they're going to run a lot of that offense through Todd Gurley. Going on to the wide receivers, it's a lot of not a whole lot of talent. Kenny Britt, he's shown flashes. He's also had extracurricular activities where he can't seem to stay on the good side of the law. But Kenny Britt, if he is healthy, he's a solid wide receiver. I wouldn't want him to be my number 1. And I'm not necessarily sure if I'd want him to be my number 2 wide receiver, especially with either Case Keenum or a rookie quarterback in Jared Goff being my provider. So Kenny Britt, at the moment, I see him as a wide receiver 3, maybe a flex possibility, but more than likely, I'd want somebody else on my team to take that position. Beyond him, you got Tavon Austin, who the Rams spent a high draft pick on a couple of years ago, and he just hasn't really panned out. He's that weapon kind of player who they run a lot of trick plays for him. It's a lot of end arounds and trying to just get him the ball so he can get into motion. So if Jared Goff can somehow form a connection with Tavon Austin with bubble screens and all that kind of stuff, Tavon Austin could have a good year, but he's not a dependable fantasy player. He's your typical boomer bust player who it kills players in fantasy. And when you're trying to put a team together, you want to put together the guys who are going to give you points every week. And Tavon Austin just isn't that kind of player. And then beyond him, Brian Quick is probably your next best option, who, if you draft Brian Quick, you may have issues with fantasy football. Their tight end, Lance Kendricks, he's okay, but he's no Jared Cook. And the Rams are definitely going to suffer not having him around this year. So Lance Kendricks he's serviceable best, but I'm not starting him as a tight end. So to recap the Rams, Jared Goff, Case Keenum. Case Keenum, you're not drafting at all. There's other quarterbacks out there who you can pick up that are better than him. And Jared Goff, unless in a 2-quarterback league, maybe drafting him late in rounds. In standard leagues, if you're looking for a keeper player, maybe drafting Jared Goff late, but he's not going to do a whole lot for you this year. Todd Gurley, the really only bright point on this team, he's going to go in the first round, probably in the first 6 picks. Trey Mason and Benny Cunningham, I'd look for those guys. I'd look for Trey Mason somewhere in the middle part of the draft, and Benny Cunningham probably more towards the later rounds. Kenny Britt and Tavon Austin, I'd start looking for those guys in the 7th or 8th round. If one of those guys clearly comes out as the number 1 wide receiver, maybe move them up to the 6th round, but both of those guys, they're going to be boom or bust, and more than likely they're going to get hurt at some point this year. And Brian Quick, don't draft him at all. Same thing with Lance Kendricks. So the Rams are a mess, and unless we see marked improvement, they're going to continue to be a mess. And talking about messes, we'll move on to the 4th team in the NFC West, the San Francisco 49ers. When Jim Harbaugh left them, he pretty much ruined them. They had Jim Tomsula come in, and as much of a good guy he might be, he was just way in over his head. He had tons of players retiring, which that's their right. And a lot of them it was for to be able to preserve their bodies. And we're probably going to see a lot of that in coming years. But that's another subject for another day in another podcast, really. But Tomsula really wasn't playing with a full deck of cards. He got let go, and the 49ers brought in Chip Kelly, who I'm not sure if it was kind of undecided how good he was in Philadelphia. I think that his first year, he was productive. Last year was obviously a mess, and I don't think he really had everything needed to have his offense run the way it was supposed to. As much as he may say Sam Bradford was the quarterback he wanted, I don't think he wanted Marcus Mariota, and he didn't get him. So, he comes to San Francisco now, and I think he has a prototypical quarterback that fits his offense in Colin Kaepernick. Now, I'm not sure if Colin Kaepernick actually wants to be there. He's gone back and forth thing. He wants to trade. He wants to be on the team. He doesn't want to be on the team, and at this moment, Colin Kaepernick wants to be on the 49ers, and I think that is good news for Chip Kelly and the team. Because Colin Kaepernick, as much as people want to write him off, I think in the right system, he could be a really decent quarterback. He showed when he was with Jim Harbaugh that he was able to be productive. So I think with Chip Kelly, he may not want to be a running quarterback, but he is a mobile quarterback. So you put Colin Kaepernick in the Chip Kelly system, and I think it could really flourish. And he's going to have to win out the number 1 job, obviously, though, because they still have Blaine Gabbert there, who it'll be interesting to see what happens. Who's going to win out the spot? I'd be more comfortable if Colin Kaepernick comes out and wins the spot. I'd be more worried if Blaine Gabbert is their starting quarterback come week 1. But I'll just go on the basis that Colin Kaepernick is going to be your starter week 1. I think it's going to help Carlos Hyde. Carlos Hyde dealt with injury problems last year. He came out, had the 3-touchdown game in week 1, and everybody went crazy thinking that he was going to be so amazing. And then he really didn't do a whole lot, got injured, and kind of let people down. But hopefully this year he can kind of get off on a better foot. It'll be interesting to see how he fits into this offense. But I think he could be a dependable running back 2 option. And then beyond him, you have Sean Drone, who when Hyde was hurt, Drone was serviceable. He wasn't a world beater. He wasn't going out there and running for 150 yards and 3 touchdowns every game, but he was a dependable back. But his only real value comes when Carlos Hyde is not playing, or if he's not playing well. So Sean Drone is more likely a later round pickup in fantasy drafts. At wide receiver, it's a whole lot of it's a mess. I'm looking at these names and I'm like, oh my, are you serious? This is who you're rolling out at wide receiver? I think it's even worse than what the Lions might have. And I think the Lions really have Golden Tate and Marvin Jones. And beyond that, it's going to be a toss-up. So Torrey Smith is really the only name that you have on the San Francisco 49ers who has had really any success. And I think he struggled last year. And he may struggle this year. It's going into a new offense. But maybe if, in this system, Chip Kelly simplifies it, tells Torrey Smith, go on a go route, and our quarterback is just going to throw it to you. You could see some pretty big games for Torrey Smith, but you're also going to see boom or bust games for him. And that's been his MO really his entire career, boom or bust. So I would draft Torrey Smith accordingly that way. Then you got Quentin Patton, Bruce Ellington, who those guys are going to be middle-of-the-road wide receivers. They're probably going to get anywhere between 400 and 800 yards, but they're not going to wow anybody. I don't really want them on my team. Those are the guys that I want to let sit on the waiver wire, and whenever I need to pick up somebody, maybe I'll look at Quentin Patton, or maybe I'll look at Bruce Ellington. The only other wide receiver on that team who interests me, and it may only be Homer Love, but Aaron Burbridge, the rookie out of Michigan State. Having watched him through his college career, I see him as a really good possession receiver. And if he gets a shot, I think he could be an interesting play for the 49ers, and that would make him valuable in fantasy-wise. At tight end, you got Vance McDonald, who I think people were a little excited about last year. He just never really panned out. And more than likely, there are other options out there that you'd want to start over Vance McDonald. He may be a backup, but I'm not surprised if he would just sit on the waiver wire the entire year. So to wrap up the 49ers, Blaine Gabbert, Colin Kaepernick are your quarterbacks. Colin Kaepernick likely going to win the job over, and I would draft him somewhere. I'd probably draft him in the later rounds. I don't want him to be my starting quarterback, but he would be an interesting pickup to be a backup quarterback. Maybe even if you have two quarterbacks and you have enough roster spots to put another quarterback on your team, Colin Kaepernick is an interesting player to keep on your team. So I'd draft him more in the later rounds. Carlos Hyde, because he is a number one running back, I'd start slating him in the third round. You saw him go first or second last year. I think with his injury issues and with his lack of production last year, I think you kind of have to drop him down. So probably third or fourth round for Carlos Hyde. Sean Drone, I'd look for him in the later rounds. I don't think you need to spend too high of a pick on him. And I wouldn't even be surprised if he goes undrafted. For wide receivers, Torrey Smith, maybe as I think early for him would be sixth round because I don't think he is a true wide receiver one in fantasy. At best, Torrey Smith is probably a low end wide receiver two, maybe more of a flex play. So I'd look at the earliest for Torrey Smith in the sixth round. I'd feel probably more comfortable drafting him in the seventh or eighth round. Quentin Patton, Bruce Ellington, those guys are late round picks at best. I would leave them undrafted. And Aaron Burbridge, I would take a late round flyer for him. If he is still around in the late parts of the draft and you're just looking for depth, Aaron Burbridge, I love to take rookies and take a chance to see if they're going to pan out. So Aaron Burbridge is that kind of guy. Vance McDonald, I'd probably let him go undrafted unless you're really hurting for a tight end. Vance McDonald should not go. He shouldn't be drafted this year. And that'll wrap up around the NFL. And that'll move us to the final segment of the show, the King's Decree. This is the segment where I give you a bunch of bold predictions throughout the year, and we'll check back later to see just how right I was or how wrong I was. So last week I finally predicted somebody to have a down year, and I'm going to follow that back up with a prediction of a good player. I think I'm going to start going back and forth because I can't just keep saying everybody's going to have a good year, but we talked about the NFC West, and that's where I'm going to stick with this King's Decree. I think Doug Baldwin will be a top 3 wide receiver this year for all the reasons that I've stated before. With Russell Wilson getting better, Doug Baldwin, he jumped into the top 10 last year with the help of a lot of big games, and I think the possibility of that continuing over is really good. They don't have Marshawn Lynch, and if Russell Wilson's going to be slinging the ball around, Doug Baldwin's going to benefit from that. Last year, he came into the top 10 in scoring, and he only had 104 targets. So I really see with them moving more to a passing game, he's going to get closer to 140 targets this year, and that'll up his yards. I'm not sure if he's going to go higher than his touchdown total last year, where he had 14. But the Seahawks have a pretty easy schedule early on. My only concern would be that the Seahawks do play the Cardinals in Week 16, which is most leagues' championships. And that would concern me. I wouldn't want to have Doug Baldwin have this breakout year and then go into the championship and you're playing one of the best secondaries. But that's something that you really can't worry about. You have to get to the championship to begin with. So Doug Baldwin, I think he's going to be a top 3 wide receiver this year, and that is the King's Decree. And that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Fantasy Nerds. Thanks for sticking around. Next week we will cover the AFC West. I'll give you more news. I'll give you another decree. And we'll just talk some more football. I am Jason Jarvi. Follow me on Twitter at Jarvi the King. And I'll see you next week. Later, nerds.